Hello and welcome to this week's Strategic Processes and Management lecture. Today we'll be talking about high-tech industry and innovation management. So let's get started. Today's outline, we will talk about the development of technology. We'll also talk about the appropriating the returns to innovation, that is, how we can capture the value of an innovation. Then we'll talk about strategies to exploit innovation, and we'll talk about competing for standards, technical standards. You might call these standards wars, how we win them. And then finally, we'll talk about implementing a technology strategy. So, how does technology develop? Where does it come from? And, the question is, are invention and innovation the same things? Are they the same? Probably you can guess, if I'm asking this question, that they're not the same, and maybe you've taken an innovation management class and probably know the answer. But just to be clear, invention is based on the use of basic knowledge, the development of new knowledge that's generated perhaps through the scientific, endeavors, research institutions, the scientific method. That basic knowledge is what forms the foundation of invention. But this invention then is turned into innovation. Innovation is the process of making that invention widely available to the public. So we call that the commercialization of the invention. So innovation is actually the commercialization, and it's done through two forms. It's diffused, okay? It's diffused into society. So we call that the diffusion process. How it's spread in Turkish, I guess, yaygınlaşmak. So it's diffused in two ways. On the demand side, it's diffused through consumers adopting the product, so the adoption process. Researchers study this as the innovation adoption process. In consumer behavior, you might look at it as different segments of consumers, early adopters, innovators, late adopters. They have different segments that kind of, when an innovation comes out, like the first movers that are the ones that are most innovative, that follow technology, for example, they're the ones that jump onto the new products. And then slowly, the adoption curve, kind of steepens and then starts to level off. And you get the early adopters, the late adopters, the laggards. On the diffusion also, the innovation diffuses on the supply side through competitors imitating each other. So you'll have the initial, first innovation, the first mover, and then you'll ultimately get, copiers and imitators. So innovation is the initial commercialization of an invention, that is, bringing it to market. And, the pace of commercialization has increased over the years. So for example, we'll just take you through some examples. Jet engines, the basic knowledge was available from 17th to the 20th centuries. The basic idea of, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. The idea of thrust, right, was a very early physics principle. The first patents were in 1930. The product was launched in 1957, and then imitators actually came out a couple years later. Xerography, the basic knowledge, came out in the 19th and early 20th centuries. First patent was in 1940. The product was launched in 1958, so it was just 18 years versus the 27 years for the product launch of jet engines. And then imitators came out a bit later. It seems like they probably had, some strong protection of that, technology. Fuzzy logic controllers, the basic knowledge is from the 60s, first patents 1981. Product launch 16 years later, or sorry, 6 years later. Imitation 1 year later. MP3 players at Basic Knowledge is from the early 1990s. The first patents were in 1994. The product was launched 3 years later. And then imitators came on 2 years. So, we see that the speed with which basic knowledge is converted into an invention and then into a commercial, innovation that can be commercialized, it's happening very, very quickly, right? The pace the speed is just increasing. So a question is then, is innovation the key to success? Is this idea of being the first mover, is that really important? Well, as this famous American Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, I'm paraphrasing, but build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. And the idea is that, if you're an inventor and you invent this, great technology and you're able to, put it out to the public, the world is just going to come and knock on your door and you're going to be rich. And what do you think of that? Well, actually, not exactly, Ralph, because the world is, full of poor inventors. And also, even the first, if you try to take that invention and you try to commercialize it, it's not easy to do, especially for individuals or small companies that don't maybe have a lot of resources. So there's a problem. In fact, the question then is, how to appropriate the value of an invention, or, when you ultimately are able to commercialize it, how can you get the value from that innovation? And let's just take an example. Let me just show you an example. Like we can take, for example, as the economic value and make it look like a pie, right? So we can see who gets the share of the pie. And we'll call it the benefits from the innovation, right? Because it's not just the economic value that comes to the company that commercializes it, but it's also the users, right? Or the suppliers to that market. So, for example, if we take the pie, we divide it up, and this is actually based on a real example, and maybe you can try to guess what the example is. The innovator actually took a small slice of this market. They didn't get the biggest slice. Actually, the imitators and the other followers, they ended up getting a very large, much, much larger share of the value. But also, the suppliers were able to capture a lot of that value. The suppliers that were the ones that, made the inputs into this product. But ultimately, it was the consumers or the customers that benefited the most, that were able to actually extract the most value out of that. Mostly because of the kind of oversupply. Like there were so many competitors jumping into the market that prices were driven down, and the product that customers got was valuable in so many ways and added so much value to their lives that the economic value of that, if for example, if you think that maybe only one there was like a monopoly, right, and customers had to only buy the product from one or maybe just a few suppliers, then it would drive the prices up and the customers would get less value. Well, can you think of which example this is? It's not so easy probably, but the example is actually from the computer industry. Here is the innovator. The problem is that not all the profits go to the inventor or even to the innovator. The profitability of an innovation depends on the value that is created by it and the share of that value that the innovator is able to capture, to appropriate. So this was the PC industry. And the innovator here was the Altair 8800 computer, which is widely recognized as the spark that ignited the microcomputer revolution. It was the first commercially successful personal computer. But if you look at it, obviously it's, it's just a couple of lights, a bunch of lights and switches, and very low power. But this was the innovator in the home PC market or in the personal computer market. But then what happened? Well, all these imitators, especially like IBM, they followed all the IBM clones, and the suppliers, like you can think probably like Intel and Microsoft, right? They were able to gain a large share of that economic value that was created. But ultimately, the customers, think how much productivity and um, benefits that were obtained by the consumers of computers, right? Computers, in every aspect of our lives, it adds value, like entertainment, work, how much work is able to get done, all these things that computers now we take for granted, basically, but especially back in the, early 70s, it was like a revolution. So the question is still, we didn't answer, is it better to be the innovator or the follower, the leader or the follower? And what do you think if I ask you this question? I think most people would say, what do you think? Most people would say the innovator, right? But if we look, we have, for example, in jet airliners, de Havilland was the innovator. The follower was Boeing. Who won that race? That battle. Obviously Boeing. In float glass, we talked about this example, remember Pilkington, and the follower was Corning, and in that one, Pilkington won. But in most of these cases, I'm not going to go through one by one, but I would just urge, I'd take your time, you can pause the video and look. You can see in most of the cases, it's the follower, in these cases, that actually gained the advantage and took most of the value of that innovation. And the question we have to ask again is why? What makes it that way? What makes one company able to capture the value of an innovation while another one cannot? So if we look, the profitability of an innovation depends on two things, like the profits that can come from an innovation, right? The economic value. It comes from two sources. One is the value of the innovation to the market, to the consumer, to the user, how much they're willing to pay for it. And the other one is the innovator's ability to capture the value of the innovation. That is, how able they are to kind of wrap their arms around the profit and pull it in and keep other competitors or suppliers or, even the customers from, pulling that value, that economic value away. And this ability to capture the value of the innovation depends on four characteristics. And we call that, well, I'll tell you what this is called after, but let me just list them and then we'll go through each of these. First is the legal protection. Probably in your mind, you're thinking already, you know what this means, the legal protection of, the innovation, right? You're thinking probably something like the patent, like if you get a patent, a strong patent, that's really good for protection, right? There's also complementary resources. We'll talk about these in more detail. The tacitness of the technology and lead time. And we call this the regime of appropriability. These four characteristics or aspects of the situation tells you, how able an innovator is to capture the value. If there's a very strong regime of appropriability, the profits are captured by the innovator. When it's weak, the profits go to the others, either imitators or other players like suppliers. So we'll go through each one of these in a little bit more detail just to let you understand what they are when we come back. I'm running out of time right now, so I'll be back in just a few seconds, okay? See you soon.